There is a photograph on the wall of my grandmother's kitchen that nobody ever talked about. It has been there my entire life. A sepia-toned rectangle in a cracked wooden frame, slightly tilted to the left in the way that things tilt when nobody bothers to straighten them anymore because they have stopped truly seeing them. In the photograph, there are 7 people standing in front of a building I do not recognize, wearing clothes I cannot place in any era or country I was taught belong to us. And every single one of them is looking directly into the camera with an expression I can only describe as defiant. Not angry, not proud in the performative way, just defiant. Like people who know something the rest of the world does not and have decided for now to keep it that way. I asked about that photograph exactly once. I was 9 years old, and it was a Sunday afternoon in November, and the kitchen smelled like something I have never been able to find again in any restaurant or cookbook or country I have visited since. I pointed at the picture and asked my grandmother who those people were, and she turned from the stove without looking at the photograph and said, "That is nobody you need to know about," and changed the subject so smoothly and so finally that I understood without being told that some doors in this family did not have handles on my side. I did not ask again. I learned, the way children in families with secrets always learn, that there are questions that are allowed and questions that are not, and that the fastest way to find out which is to watch what happens to the air in the room when you ask one of the wrong ones. The air in my grandmother's kitchen changed that day. It got careful, and I got careful too. For the next 20 years, I stayed careful. I asked the questions I was allowed to ask, and I accepted the answers I was given. And I built my understanding of who I was and where I came from entirely out of the version of our family history that had been selected, edited, and handed to me like a gift I was supposed to be grateful for, without ever wondering what had been left out of the box. Our family was ordinary, I was told. We came from simple people. There was nothing remarkable about where we came from or what we had been before we became what we were now. And for a long time I believed it, not because the story was convincing, but because I wanted it to be true. Because ordinary is safe. Because simple means there are no complications waiting in the corners. Because nothing remarkable means nothing to grieve, nothing to reckon with, nothing to feel the specific ache of having been kept from. But the body keeps its own records, and mine had been keeping records my whole life without telling me. The way I felt something shift in my chest the first time I heard a particular kind of music at a street festival I wandered into by accident in my mid-20s. The way certain colors made me feel recognized in a way I could not explain. The way I could walk into a room where a specific language was being spoken and feel the edges of something familiar, even though I had never been taught a single word of it. The way food cooked in a particular way made me feel held in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. I dismissed all of it for years. I told myself I was being romantic, projecting, reaching for something to make myself feel more interesting than my ordinary, simple, unremarkable family history suggested I had any right to be. And then my grandmother got sick, and everything I had been carefully not looking at for 20 years walked through the door and stood in the center of the room and refused to be ignored any longer. She was 81, and the illness was not sudden, but the severity of it was, and there was a week in February where we did not know which way things would go, and I drove 4 hours to sit beside her bed in the house I had grown up visiting on Sundays. The house with the tilted photograph in the kitchen, and I sat there in the particular silence of someone who is not yet gone but is no longer entirely present. And I looked at her face and I thought, she is the last one who knows. Whatever is in that photograph, whatever is behind that door without a handle, she is the last living person who has the key. And if I do not ask now, the answer goes with her. I asked. Not about the photograph specifically. I started smaller because I had learned to be careful, and old habits are not broken in a single moment of resolve. I asked her what her mother's name was. She told me. I asked where her mother was born. She told me that too. And something shifted in her face when she said it. Something loosened, like a knot that had been held too long, finally being allowed to release just slightly. I asked what her mother's mother was called. And that is when she closed her eyes and said a name that did not belong to the language our family had always spoken, a name from somewhere else entirely, a name with sounds in it that my mouth did not know how to make but my chest somehow recognized, and she began to talk. She talked for 3 hours. I want you to understand what that means in the context of a woman who had spent 81 years perfecting the art of not talking. 3 hours. The light outside the window moved from the flat gray of a February afternoon to the deep blue of early evening, and I did not move from my chair, and she did not stop. And the words came out of her not in the orderly way of someone telling a story they have rehearsed, but in the urgent, tumbling way of someone who has been holding something underwater for decades and has finally, in the particular exhaustion of illness and age and the nearness of an ending, let it rise. Her grandmother, the woman whose name had sounds my mouth did not know how to make, had come from a place our family had never once mentioned in my presence. Not a country that was exotic or distant in the way that makes people romantic and curious. A place that had been, at the time her grandmother left it, dangerous in the specific way that certain places become dangerous when the people in power decide that certain kinds of people do not deserve to exist in the way they have always existed. I will not name the place yet because the naming of it is not where the story lives. The story lives in what her grandmother carried when she left. She carried 3 things, my grandmother told me, her eyes still closed, her hands still on the blanket. She carried a language. She carried a set of practices so old that nobody in the family had ever been able to trace their origin with certainty, only that they had been passed down mother to daughter for as far back as anyone could remember. And she carried a profound and well-founded terror that being known, being visible, being identifiably herself in the new place she was going would get her killed. So she buried it. Not gradually, not reluctantly. With the swift and total efficiency of someone who understands that survival sometimes requires you to perform your own disappearance. She gave her children a new version of the family, a simpler version, an ordinary version. She told them they came from simple people. There was nothing remarkable about where they came from. And she said it with such conviction, my grandmother told me, with such completeness, that her children believed her, and her children's children believed it, and her children's children's children, meaning my mother, believed it. And my mother's child, meaning me, was handed the same carefully constructed, ordinary, simple, unremarkable story and told to be grateful for it. I sat in that chair beside my grandmother's bed and I felt something happening inside me that I do not have a clean word for. It was not anger, though anger was part of it. It was not grief, though grief was part of it too. It was something more like the sensation of a room you have been living in your entire life suddenly revealing a second door, and you walk through it and find another room, and another door, and another room. And you understand that the house you thought you knew has been hiding its own architecture from you, and you are simultaneously devastated that you did not know and desperate to see every room, to open every door, to run your hands along every wall that was kept from you. I asked her why. I asked why her grandmother had not told her children the truth when they were grown, when the danger had passed, when it was safe to be known again. And my grandmother opened her eyes and looked at me with an expression that I recognized from the photograph in the kitchen, that specific defiance, and she said, because by then she did not know how. Because the burial had been so complete and so long that the thing she had buried had become unfamiliar even to her. Because there is a particular kind of loss that happens not in a single moment but across decades. And by the time you look up and try to find what you lost, you cannot remember exactly what it looked like anymore. And she said something else. She said that her grandmother had been afraid that if she told them, they would not want it, that they had built lives without it and would see it not as a gift but as a disruption. That they would look at this thing she had carried across borders and through terror and through the long performance of not being herself, and they would say, "Thank you, but we are fine without it." And I understood then that the hiding had not only been about survival, it had also been about a particular kind of heartbreak that my great-great-grandmother had protected herself from by never offering the real thing to people who might refuse it. I drove home from my grandmother's house that night in the dark, and I pulled over twice because I could not see the road properly. Not because I was crying exactly, though I was doing something in that vicinity. Because I was trying to reckon with the fact that the entire story I had been given about myself was not a lie in the way that lies are usually constructed. Nobody had sat down and decided to deceive me. What had happened was quieter and more complicated, and in some ways more devastating than a simple lie. What had happened was a family that had learned to be afraid of itself and had passed that fear down so carefully. And so completely that by the time it reached me, it no longer felt like fear, it felt like fact. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote down everything my grandmother had told me. The name that had sounds my mouth did not know how to make. The place. The practices she had described in fragments half remembered some of the edges worn away by time and silence. But the shapes still visible underneath, the way the shapes of old buildings are still visible beneath new ones if you know how to look. If you know how to look, I wrote it all down and then I sat there looking at what I had written. And I made a decision that I did not know then would take me 3 years to fully act on. I decided that whatever had been buried, I was going to find it, not to be dramatic, not to perform a heritage I had not lived, but because something in my body had been keeping records my whole life, and those records pointed towards something real, something that existed before the fear, something that had survived the burial because the burial had never been quite complete. Things that are loved deeply enough are never quite completely buried. They leave traces, and I was going to follow everyone. The first trace I found was in a library, which is perhaps the least dramatic place for a revelation. But also, I have come to understand exactly the right one. Libraries are where things go when people want them to survive without being seen. I had been searching for 3 weeks, following the thread my grandmother had given me, and I had hit walls everywhere I turned. Databases that did not recognize the spelling of the name, records that had been altered or destroyed or simply never kept. Because the people they belonged to had been the kind of people whose records nobody bothered to maintain. And then a librarian in a small building 2 towns away from where I grew up, a woman with reading glasses pushed up into her hair. And the particular patience of someone who has spent a lifetime helping people find things they did not know how to look for, asked me what I was actually searching for underneath the names and the dates. And I told her, and the name with sounds my mouth still did not know how to make correctly. And she looked at me for a long moment. And the name with sounds my mouth still did not know how to make correctly. And she looked at me for a long moment. And then she stood up and walked to a section of shelving I had not noticed and pulled out a book that was not a book exactly, but a collection of preserved documents, handwritten, some of them in a language I could not read, and she set it on the table in front of me and said, "Start here." I do not know how long I sat at that table, long enough for the light through the windows to change twice. What I found in those pages was not a complete picture. It was never going to be a complete picture, and I have had to make peace with that, with the fact that some of what was buried stayed buried, and the water that got in during all those years of silence damaged things that cannot be fully restored. But what I found was enough to confirm that what my grandmother had described in fragments was real, was documented, was part of a living tradition that had not died even when the people carrying it had done everything in their power to make it disappear. I found the practices she had described. I found their names, their origins, their meanings, the specific logic of why they had been done the way they had been done. Across generations of women in my family's line, I found evidence of a community that had gathered around these practices, that had maintained them through difficulty and displacement, that had carried them forward with the same stubborn insistence that living things have on continuing to live, even in conditions that were never designed to support them. And I found something I was not looking for, which is often how the most important things are found. I found a woman living in her 70s who had spent 40 years collecting and preserving exactly the kind of history I had just discovered I came from. I wrote to her that evening from the parking lot of the library, sitting in my car in the dark, the way I seemed to keep finding myself sitting in cars in the dark at moments of significance. And I told her who I was and where I came from and what my grandmother had told me. She wrote back within an hour. She said she had been waiting for someone from my family line to reach out for a very long time. That sentence undid something in me that I am not sure had a name before it came undone. She had been waiting, which meant she had known we existed, which meant the tradition had known about us even when we had been made to forget about it. The months that followed were not simple, and I will not pretend they were. There is a particular complexity to reclaiming something that was hidden from you by people who loved you, People who were themselves victims of the same hiding, people who made choices out of fear that had real and legitimate roots, even if the consequences of those choices were ones I had spent my whole life paying without knowing what the bill was for. I had to learn to hold two things simultaneously: the grief of what had been kept from me and the compassion for why it had been kept. Those two things do not resolve into each other neatly. They do not cancel each other out. They simply exist together the way most true things exist, in a tension that you learn to carry rather than a contradiction that you resolve. I began learning the language, slowly, badly, with the specific humiliation of an adult trying to make sounds that children make naturally, trying to train a mouth and a memory that had been kept deliberately empty of this for decades. I began learning the practices, working with the woman I had found, meeting others through her, entering a community that welcomed me with a warmth that felt ancient. That felt like something my body recognized, even as my mind scrambled to catch up. I brought what I was learning back to my grandmother. She was recovering, slowly, in the particular stubborn way of people who have survived too much to surrender easily to illness, village life. And I would sit beside her and tell her what I had found, and she would listen with her eyes closed, and sometimes she would correct my pronunciation of a word in the language neither of us had been taught, and I would realize that the language had been inside her all along, buried but not gone, village life, waiting in the body the way things that are deeply learned always wait, below the level of conscious memory, in the place where the self keeps its oldest records. Village life. The last Sunday I spent with her before she passed, she asked me to do something. She asked me to take the photograph from the kitchen wall and keep it village life. She told me the names of all 7 people in it, every single one, names with sounds that my mouth was slowly learning to make, village life. And she told me what she knew of each of their stories, and I wrote every word down. And then she said something I have carried with me every day since. And then she said something I have carried with me every day since. She said, "Now it does not end with me, village life." That is what the hiding had really been about, I understood then. Not shame, not fear, not the practical terror of survival, though all of those things were true. Village life. Underneath all of it was this: the fear that it would end, that the line of transmission would break. Village life. That the thing passed mother to daughter for longer than anyone could trace would finally find a generation that could not hold it and would let it fall. Village life. My great-great-grandmother had buried it to protect it, and in protecting it had nearly lost it. And now it was in my hands, imperfect and incomplete and real, village life. And I was the one who got to decide what happened next. Village life. The photograph hangs in my home now, straightened. I know all 7 names. I am learning all the sounds. Village life. And I have made a promise to the woman in that picture, the one with the defiant expression, village life. The one who carried something across borders and through terror and through the long performance of not being herself, village life. A promise that what she carried will not be buried again. Not on my watch, not in my house, village life. Not in the story I choose to tell about where I come from and who I am and what I was always, even before I knew it, made of. Village life.